Good evening. It's Joyful Christian Hermit. Probably been about 3 weeks ago. One of the viewers, and I don't know if the person is still watching or not, but asked me to share about my upbringing in churches, my experiences in churches growing up. And I think the person was having difficulty being in churches, perhaps. And maybe you wanted to know if I found that too. But so I'll share a little bit about my upbringing and going to church. I was baptized a Methodist when I was not quite 1 year old. It was April 6th, 1950, in our local Methodist church where my mom and dad went to church. And my dad had been reared in that church. My mother had gone to a Evangelical United Brethren growing up. But in high school, she joined the Methodist Church because that's where most of the kids were. They had a youth group even when she was growing up, etc. And she didn't meet my dad per se there, but he probably would have been going there then, obviously. They met in high school, small town. So he was 2 years older. And I think had their first date. I know they had it on Valentine's Day. I believe when she was 16, he would have been 18, nearly graduating, or he might have already graduated because he was double promoted, I think, in the second grade. So went there to church. I remember cradle roll, little, classrooms for preschool, and we'd go, they had like a little place to go instead of being in church all the time. Way back then, they were handling that with little children. And then otherwise, probably from 5 years old on, I would sit in church with my parents, but we would have an hour of Sunday school beforehand. I had wonderful Sunday school teachers and learned a lot. I loved it. Had my friends there, people that I saw at school, and but no one. I didn't particularly play with anyone. My dad took a job when I was just one still, and it was a traveling job with the company he worked with, district sales manager, and it was a good increase in pay, a step up. So he did that. So he was gone most of, during the week. My mother, I was the third of three girls, and my dad wanted more to try for a boy, but she didn't want to. And she was ready to do something with her life, stimulating. Finish her college. She'd gone 2 years to college, which was quite something during Depression time. And so she finished her college at the local college, taking classes. And so I don't really have much memory of my mother when I was little. She was reading or going to classes. My grandmother came and stayed, her mother. And I was very close to that grandmother. That's the one that's appeared to me a couple of times with messages after I was divorced, and I would call out to her because I knew she would understand. Her husband died suddenly of a bleeding ulcer when he was 47. It was a week before the stock market crash, or 2 weeks before, right before. I think a week or 10 days is all. And they had 8 children, ages 18 to 4. My grandmother was younger than him. She was 38, I think, at the time, and he was 47 or just about 47. They met because she worked at the restaurant that he and his brother owned. She was a waitress there and fell in love. and he built a home. He had just gotten in recently into the city, into politics. He was elected to be a councilman or some such thing. Plus owned the restaurant, half of it, and worked there. So it was a horrible ordeal, and I always thought she would be able to help me. I had 3 children. Of course, I was injured, but alone, a grass widow. And so she did. She came, and she's the first one to tell me basically, what my future, that I would have to learn to live like a bear for protection from the world. And had me look down, and she said, and when I get into pain or upset, things get difficult, a lot of suffering. I was to press in the center of my palms. And I immediately, even in that, it was a waking, I was wide awake in the night, midnight or something, I think she appeared, or 3 in the morning. Might have been 3 in the morning. It was one of the watches of the night, a holy time. And first time anything like that had happened to me, to have someone appear. But so I really remember her, and she was a lovely woman, and I suppose favored me because I favored her. Doesn't it work like that? When we really care about someone, they tend to care about us, as long as we're not obsessive or chasing after someone. But I always loved her and appreciated her. And I would, I'd go off to kindergarten and come home, and she'd be there. We'd have lunch. I'd help her wash dishes and do things, then take a nap. Maybe she'd let me watch, not much, but there was a program that As the World Turns, soap opera, and she'd let me watch sometimes before I'd take my nap. But lots of conversations with her. And so all this time, we'd go to church on Sunday, and Sunday school and church, and expected to behave, sitting in the pew and be quiet, try to listen, to have night prayers. And my mother had books for us. She always had books in a bookcase for us, children's books, lots of children's books. And I would get to go with her to the college library when she would have to go to look up things. I could go to the children's section, so I liked that. It was a Christian college that she went to finish her BA in English. And later, and then got a master's. She started teaching when I was in in kindergarten. So my grandmother was very instrumental in my early years. And I remember my mother, but usually reading or busy. So I had a lot of time alone, which I never had problems finding things to do by myself. My next older sister was 3 years older, and the eldest was 5 years older. So from 2 on, they were in school. I was 2 when they were in school. And I remember early on, my next elder sister would tease me a lot. I think she would have been very happy not to have had another sibling, and for her to be the baby. That's often the case of a child that has another one follow. I noticed. I think that can happen. I've sort of thought it with my own children a little bit. But and most of them outgrow it, so my sister outgrew that, I think. I hope. But she had some Christian books. So one of my favorites I have to this day. It's a little book, well, 2 of them. One was on the 10 Commandments, and the other one was a child's story of Jesus. Just little teeny hardback or cardboard, 1950s construction type of books. very sweet. And then she bought Hurlbut's Stories of the Bible, a big fat book. And on occasion, my dad would read to the next older sister and myself when we would share a room. And then she got her own room. But he didn't do it very often, but I loved that when he would read a Bible story, and I'd beg him to read. And often he'd be busy, doing his accounts, his invoices that he would have to sort. Later on, hired me to do them. I like doing that. Make 50 cents. So on a Sunday afternoon, but I didn't know then he was an alcoholic. His dad was, and his brother was. And I think his drinking started a lot. He was stationed in England in World War II, and they would go to the pubs. So I think it was a hereditary trait. And they now, I think it was a rehab place in San Diego, California, because I have a dear friend whose husband was a very quiet alcoholic, and he went to rehab. And but it wasn't the same as my dad. He didn't have family history or anything, but maybe depression, something like that. He started drinking to feel better. But also, they had done some testing and experiments. This rehab place, or it was the recent literature, that they think that some alcoholics are alcoholics because they have a dopamine deprivation. Their brain doesn't generate enough dopamine. So they seek sugar, they seek alcohol that has a lot of sugar, that gives you a feel-good rush, or feel like chocolate or candy can, and then you crash. But of course, alcohol does a lot more. It alters the person's behavior, and you become addicted, and you can become addicted to candy, to sugar, but it's not as damaging as alcoholism. So I thought when she told me that, it was after my father had passed, and my dad stopped drinking when I was 11. I found out when I was in 4th grade. It was very traumatic for me. And then my mother, maybe it was a half a year later, it was in the springtime, in Lent, springtime, early spring, and she'd gone to the Presbyterian church that year, was having Lenten services on every Wednesday. And she went, and she gathered us. She sat on the piano bench, and we were on the floor around her. My eldest sister, who then, I was in 4th grade, she would have been in 9th grade, a freshman in high school. My next eldest sister was in 7th grade, and I was in 4th grade. And she said that she thought she heard her dad's voice tell her, leave him, leave him. And we said, oh, no, don't do that. All of us didn't want her to do that. And she mentioned how her mother, even my grandmother, had been praying. My grandmother then went out to California to be with an aunt who had started a marvelous fabric store. And my grandmother was there to help take care of her youngest son, and she had 2 older sons, 3 boys. And I think they all lived there. One was in the service and he'd come back, but the youngest was there, and he was maybe in 6th grade at the time, and I was in 4th grade, and the other one was older, and he was in high school, and then her eldest child was just in the military, didn't go to college. So she was needed out there. My grandmother would do that. She would go where needed. And her husband had built a home that they lived in before they passed, a nice home. I couldn't believe how small, though, for 8 children. But the eldest when he died, had started going to college, a teacher's college. So she wasn't in the home. But it was rough times for my grandmother. I always knew that. I sensed it. I loved to hear her tell me. I would ask her so many questions when I was little. Always wanted to hear about family and all the relatives, and but otherwise I kept myself busy by myself. And that's part of my contemplative nature, but I didn't recognize it, obviously, until well into adulthood, until actually after I became Catholic when I was 44. So that's sort of she said, my mother said, my mother's praying for him. My grandmother loved my dad. And he was a wonderful man. He just had this terrible problem, horrible drinking problem, and was a gentleman drunk, but he traveled. So I didn't know anything about it until he came home drunk. My uncle had to bring him home from the golf course. He would stop there on the way into town. And so it was my turn to fix meals that week. And my grandmother had taught me how to fix fried chicken. I had mashed potatoes. I was in fourth grade, but I loved doing it, that my mother wanted us to learn to take turns. Well, she was busy by then, very busy with her teaching. And so, and she belonged to various clubs and had 3 daughters that she, made sure we had we're doing our homework and had good grades, and had a sister and a sister-in-law in town that she was close with, and other friends. So she had a busy schedule. And my grandmother was there, so I always loved having grandmother show me things. And I remember the first time she trusted me to dry this very beautiful crystal glass cut bowl. And I have that bowl now. So, that was a big, that was when I was in kindergarten and would wash dish or dry things that she would let me dry. Tupperware was invented, just invented. So plastic, I could dry those things. But so when my mother mentioned that my grandmother was praying, I said, "Oh, we could all pray. We could all pray every night. I promise I'll pray every night. But don't leave him." And my sisters chimed in too. So that's my first major accounting of something that I really, really wanted, and that I remember praying for every single night. I remember the bedroom and the twin bed I was in, and I had a room by myself. Usually I had shared with my sister, but I finally had a room to myself. We had enough rooms. Well, my grandmother would always have one room. So that's why when she went out to California, we all got we girls each got our own bedroom. And it was, I was very intense about it. And we were told we weren't to tell anyone about Dad. My mother didn't want anyone to know. I remember a girl I knew from school, who her older sister had seen him. He'd had a slight accident in the downtown. It was in summertime, so we were at the lake, but she saw it. Or her dad, I think she saw it with her dad. Her dad worked on in a building in the corner where this happened. And she's, "Oh, wow, he was staggering around. He was so dry." And I was just like mortified that anyone would see him like that, because he was a very respected and respectable person with a very bad problem. But it took 2 years, when I was in 6th grade, February of 6th grade, so not quite 2 years, of every night praying. My dad showed me this little round medal and told me he was sorry that he had been as he was, as he had been, but that he had stopped drinking and he was never going to drink again. And he showed me his serenity prayer that he said he prays. Every day he said he prayed it. And showed me this little coin that he had joined AA. A man from our church, an older man, was his sponsor and got him involved. So that's the first time I remember a prayer that I prayed and prayed being answered like that. So that really opened me up to the reality of God and the power of prayer. And I was thrilled, and my dad never drank again. So in 6th grade, our church, my mother, in fact, with other women, she was very much organizing things and very busy doing things and was civic-minded and church-minded. And during my dad's drinking, she had a very good friend, a woman who was like an associate minister at our church, which was novel to have a woman back then in the 50s. But Pat was her name. And Mother was very close with that woman. So that was lovely. And so by 6th grade, though, in 4th grade and 5th grade, there was a youth group for young children, for 4th grade and 5th graders that my mother started called OWL, like owl, but it was Others We Love. So I loved going to that on Saturday afternoons, but that disbanded. I don't think they had enough adults to operate it on Saturday afternoons to have programs. But for as long as they had it, I liked it. And in 6th grade, then they had a youth meeting or youth group of prayer and a service, and it was they had an altar call. So it wasn't just for kids from our church, but other churches, Protestant churches in the town. And so they had an altar call, and I went up front. And I was very serious about it all. It meant a lot. I went on, and I'm very self-conscious. I was then, I still am. It was hard for me to walk up in front of people, because it seemed a very private thing for me. But I went up, and a good friend of my mom and dad's, she and her husband had worked at this retreat. It was a 3-day, or Friday night, Saturday night, and a Sunday afternoon. I'm not sure what you would call like a revival. Yes, it was a revival for the teenagers in the town. And, the sixth through high school, 6th grade through high school. So I did the altar call, and they, an adult would come and talk and with each child individually or teen, and ask if we had any questions about Jesus or anything. And I didn't say much, but I really took it to heart that I'd given my life to Christ. I also liked it when there would be programs in our church, our Methodist church. There was a missionary that we sponsored. Well, 2 actually. One was a couple. They went to India. And the other was this woman, Roxy LaForge, who was in China. I didn't know until I was an adult and had moved back to my hometown and did an article on her. So someone gave me all her letters from that time period to read when she was a missionary, first in China and then in the Philippines. She was in the Philippines Death March in World War II. Miraculous that she lived. But she was engaged when very young, and her fiance died suddenly, probably of the flu or typhoid, influenza of the 1916 time period, or typhoid fever, which was strong, or even tuberculosis. Any of those three were rampant in that time period. She left maybe in 1920, so she became a missionary. It was the Church of United Brethren or something like that. United Brethren Church, maybe it's called. So, but she would come to our Methodist church when she'd be back on furlough and give talks. And I was fascinated by her. And also when this couple would come back from India, they were missionaries. So that was fascinating. So when I was in college, I had a chance to do a 5-week study trip in India during the month of May, 5 weeks of May, end of April and all of May. And my parents let me do that. They paid for me to do that. And I've always loved India since. I also, as a child, wanted to be an African missionary. I don't know why Africa, because we didn't have any African missionaries come. But that just seemed something that I would like to do. But I also, as I grew older, even as a girl, I wanted to be a mother, to get married and be a mother, have children. So that won out of my wishes. In college, I loved theology. I hadn't taken any theology until college, which was a Presbyterian-based college, so a Protestant theology, but I took a class and I loved that, and I considered being a minister. Seriously did. But decided against it because we had had another woman assistant pastor, and the women just weren't that effective. They weren't received that well. But I realized it wasn't because they weren't bright and they weren't wonderful. It's because when their voices don't carry in the same way, and they don't have a certain attribute about them, the masculine attribute, that lends itself to that type of ministry and leadership of both men and women in a congregation. I recognized that, and even then I thought about Jesus. And he didn't have, he had women who helped, but they weren't apostles. And that always impressed me, and I think there's something to it. The projection and the body stance, it seems not all women, but most, I'd be one. We can be more emotionally driven than a man, and maybe get more upset right away over problems. And I didn't see it also in conjunction with a family. I wanted to be married and have a family. And I didn't see how being a minister, giving my life to Christ in that way, that I could do both. So I didn't have any problem being Catholic, let me tell you that, with the male priesthood. And in the Methodist Church at the time, and all the churches, the lead minister was always a male. And it made sense to me. Problems would arise within the congregation, and the man would calmly handle them for the most part. The assistant ministers, they just didn't carry that kind of weight. It's hard to say. It's nothing tangible, really. It's an essence of a difference between a woman and a man. And in the ministry of leadership and of also caring for souls, And now women can be very nurturing in that regard, but the preaching and all, and the keeping people from being at each other's throats, which can happen, or nitpicking or envies. A lot of men have an innate ability, or what would you call it, an essence, the masculine nature of the father. That all of them were married and had children. They were fathers, they were husbands, and they were heads of families. So it just seemed right, and I didn't think that I could succeed as well being a female as a minister. But there would be other things I thought I could do. I didn't know what. But being a mother, the mother is often the main person teaching the children and living the faith for the children to emulate, reading the Bible stories. And also in 5th grade, I was given a Bible. All of the 5th graders were. We technically joined the church then when we were in 5th grade. We didn't have a lot of any preparation like the Catholics children do. That they're usually 13 or 14 years old when they go through confirmation. But we all had a Sunday where we were called up front and were given our Bibles. It had my name on it. It's a Revised Standard Version. And I would try to read it at night. I took it seriously. But I couldn't quite get into it. I couldn't grasp. If someone had guided me and said, well, read some Psalms, or put me into some of the Old Testament, or even the parables, things like that. But I just started out, I think I started out reading John, the book of John. And that was when I was in 5th grade. And I just couldn't grasp. I was too young. And also, I think I built it up so much. This is the Word of God, and took it very seriously, that I think I was clutching, inside. I was, tense or something, and thinking, oh, I've got to understand every word, because this is God's word and it's important. And, I built it up too much in my mind as far as an urgent thing, and that I had to understand it all. Took it too seriously in that regard for what God would have expected of someone in 5th grade. But these things are sort of hints to me as to how I am later in life. Well, all through really, but especially once I married and then after the divorce. I knew, Jesus is my maker. Or my maker is my husband. That's in Isaiah, and I claimed that verse. My maker is my husband. So those are just some of the things. The altar call, I went down, and that was very, very serious. I didn't know what to expect. And a woman and her husband were there who were, they happened to be Presbyterian, but it was ecumenical, this revival was. And our new youth minister, who was a real asset, he was there all through my high school, too, junior high and high school then. And he was outstanding. He built a great youth program. So he instigated it, or not in a bad way. He planted the seeds and organized and invited the other main churches around, Protestant churches. In my town, it was just a total divide. I really had nothing to do or knew nothing much about Catholicism. other than I'd had a Catholic playmate move in next door. First, only child in the neighborhood that I could play with, and but not for long. They moved in when I was in kindergarten, or right before I went, or maybe it was in the fall they moved in. I think it was in the fall, autumn, September, right before school started, I think. And Peggy was a year older, but we had so much fun playing. And all through that year and into the next, but by the time she got into second grade, my mother got very concerned, I think. My parents were anti-Catholic. So she told me I couldn't play with Peggy until I had another friend to play with, a friend from my school or something. So I worked hard at that for a while because Peggy and I just really hit it off. We had a lot of fun. Really, she was my first friend. My first friend. Other than a brief friendship with a girl up at the end of the block. But they soon moved to Florida. But they were friends of my parents and things. Her parents were. And she was a very nice girl. And I had another friend then once I met her in second grade, I think. Or third grade, I guess. Evelyn. And so we had that friendship for 2 years, and they moved when she was going into fourth grade. I think they moved, so about a year and a half. We were friends, but all through third grade at least, and maybe they moved partway through fourth grade. But she wasn't. I don't think so. Or yes, they were still there, but she wasn't in my class in fourth grade. So we had a little school, but maybe like 2 fourth grade classes, so she wasn't in mine. Then you didn't see the other children. You were in your own classroom all day. So this friend who of my parents, she talked to me, and she stopped by later that evening. I think dropped my eldest sister off because her daughter and my eldest sister were friends. And she got her face right down. Her eyes were very intense, if it wasn't. She said, well, you had quite an experience, quite a date night tonight, didn't you? And how proud she was of me and all that. And so that made me all the more, want to try to read the Bible. And we were given these little booklets, getting to know Jesus or something, or developing a relationship with Christ. And it was really beyond me. But I didn't experience anything that overtly or within either that I recognized of, having given my life to Christ, because I already had. I already loved Christ. I already, I already prayed. I already knew he was God's son. And Christmas Eve, we would always have a little service. My mother would have us have a service. And also we had to have little devotions before we could open presents on Christmas morning. And and my sister, we had the old-fashioned TVs that were sort of blocky and on a blocky stand, and we'd push that out. It was on rollers, I think the stand was, or somehow, and we'd get behind it in the corner. It was angled, and there was in the corner of the room, and we'd get behind there, and that was our pulpit, and we would preach, and my eldest sister and mom and dad would have to listen to us, and we'd decide we would read the scriptures in Luke of the Nativity, and that sequence of scriptures, and say prayers and things, and I love doing that. I think that led me to think in college again about being a minister, see. But I thought through and made my choice that I wanted to. And then the being a missionary to Africa, that fell by the wayside because I wanted to be a mother and married, a wife and mother. It's very important to me. And God allowed that of me. I'm so grateful for my children. And had what I loved it. They're growing up and all and into adulthood, but things have gone a little bit south. So, but I still have many, many good years to think of. On my part, as far as I was viewing back, my kids obviously view back and don't have the same remembrances that I have. So, anyway, so it was just, I was a good girl. I believed in Jesus. I loved Jesus. When I was in seventh grade, I've mentioned before that I told God, I said, I want to do something great for you, God, with my life. I want to, whatever I do, just let me know. Let me know what I'm to do. I want to do something great for you. And I've concluded that to God, suffering is great. Enduring through suffering. That's what he has me as a person of prayer and suffering. And to him, that's the great thing he asked of me and allowed me to have, showed me his will. And I know someone online is talking about me that I'm going around saying that God wills this terrible suffering on people and it's punitive, but that's because she has this perspective. She doesn't have God's perspective. That suffering is sheer joy in other levels and dimensions. That suffering gives us gifts. That suffering teaches us. And that in suffering we come to love. We come to understand love fully. That suffering and love are intertwined. So, see, if you don't know that, if you don't perceive and understand from God's perspective, suffering isn't a horrible thing to God. We make it into a horrible thing. Now, God he doesn't send suffering to punish us, but it's a tool, it's a gift. It's through suffering that he was able to get me freed and my husband on his way after we'd had our third child. He was just a baby. And when the marriage broke, when my husband said he didn't want to be married anymore and didn't really want to work on it, I insisted we go to a counselor, but that was a waste. Nothing's ever a waste, but monetarily it was. For the most part, it didn't change the husband's mind, in other words, and he wasn't willing to take any responsibility for his behavior and his affairs. So he didn't want to admit to things he had done that would be upsetting to any other partner, And his temper, and the lies that he would say. He couldn't admit to those things. So I realized later on, much later on, wasn't long ago, that all of that God arranged. He allowed it to happen. I would never have gotten a divorce on my own, no matter how hard it got, because I believe in marriage and in living my vows. Unless there's something like adultery, which Jesus talks about. And so when he admitted adultery, I did feel released. But if it can be adultery if someone is abusing, that can be a form of adultery, adulteration. Look up the word to adulterate, and you'll see the root of it, and you'll see what I mean. Doesn't have to mean sexual adultery. can be other kinds of adultery. Adulteration, to adulterate. So, all of these things, I took my vows seriously, and we had a church wedding. In college, had I stayed at this one college, I think I would have switched my major to theology. By then, I'd had a rough first year and second year. Yeah, the second year I had to have pilonidal cyst surgery at Christmas time. And of course, it got infected. Wouldn't you know? And it was a very severe case, the surgeon said. They nearly had to remove my tailbone. The cysts had grown so much. So then I can look back and see just what kind of, I can take a lot of pain. I have high pain tolerance. Nothing that I'm doing, it's just how I am, how I was born. I can take a lot of pain and I can endure a lot. So see, that lends itself, God created me, and it lends myself to a life of prayer and suffering as my mission. So would never have thought of it, that would be what I would do with my life. And that would be the great thing that I would do for God, is to try to suffer well and to pray well. Prayer, of course, is communicating with God. And communication includes listening. And that's something I need to improve upon. So, as far as churches, I went to the Methodist Church High School. I was in the Methodist Youth Fellowship, MYF. And I was elected president of it my senior year, which was a great honor. But then I found out, I didn't know yet that I had been elected. But one of my friends, he had another minister, and he was a very nice man and wife with 5 sons. And one of the sons was my age. And so I had this other really good guy friend from church, Rod. And so Rod and I had a lot of fun. And Jeff also. And then there were 2 guys in the next year. I didn't have many girls going that went. I would try to get them to go, but not in my class. There was one that was maybe a year younger, but no. So there were other girls, either older or younger, but I was the main one that went every week to MYF and thought up a lot of creative ideas of outreaches we could do and ways to get more kids to come and things like that. I was always sort of like that. I like to plan and create and be active, and a hands-on person. I still am. As far as my work, manual labor. But Jeff's dad, the minister, this couple, they were a lovely couple, older couple, they never had children, and they were devoted youth group sponsors. Be there every Sunday and sort of lead, but help the youth leaders, us lead ourselves, but we're always there, like a surrogate parents. Lovely couple, very kind. But the wife, I had won, I guess overwhelmingly, was voted to be president, which was going to be a first ever to have a girl president of MYF. I guess people felt I deserved it, I did a lot, thought up a lot, and I don't know, I guess I was always a good student. I think teachers always knew I was a good person and a good student, and kids did too. I got invited to some parties. I never really cared about parties, or really not much even dating. but I sort of forced myself to date a couple of a couple of different guys, maybe three, but not for long, because I always knew I was going to college, and why get sidetracked, what with guys? Just wait, wait till you're older. So I was very practical in that sense, which I'm not practical in other senses. And so, but these guys went to the church. Obviously, Jeff was the minister's son, and he found out that the woman um, wasn't going to let me be the president, even though I was elected to it. And she wanted Rod, my good friend Rod, because she felt a guy should be the president. And that so upset, well, the minister was in a tight spot. He was upset by it, though. And that's how his son found out. And then the son told me, Jeff told me. But Jeff refused to, he was voted, I think, treasurer. And he refused the position. And Manette, that was the woman's name, and Dean was her husband, said that I could be secretary. She admitted it then and said that she just they couldn't allow it. So that I could be secretary, though she offered me that. And I said, no, thank you. I have enough, papers my senior year to write. I don't need to be writing anymore. And, but part of it was, I felt that if Jeff was going to take a stand, I would too. And because it wasn't right. But that was a situation. And the senior year we didn't do that much, but it was all right. Mentally, I was pretty much already gone away, out thinking of college, So, just, doing my best to keep my grades up and my GPA, and got some awards and all that, but still going to church. There was another girl, but she moved away when we were freshmen. She moved in when we were in 6th grade, and so that was fun. We joined the choir together one time, the adult choir, but younger people could. If you got to be in, junior high was the earliest that we could join, 8th grade. But we got into trouble because we were whispering, and it was terrible. I felt terrible later. I don't know why we did that. I knew it was wrong. I'm weak. I was weak. Yielded to temptation. Whispered during the church service. So, and giggled and things, and the choir you could see from the pews. And so, but my parents didn't, I didn't get heavily punished. They knew evidently I was sensitive, and they just said, you're not going to be in the choir anymore if you can't behave. So, and you can't sit with Mary Jane. Obviously too much temptation for you, It was. So these are my church experiences. When I was married, when I went to college, it was a Presbyterian college, and I went once or twice to church on Sunday morning, but it just didn't, it wasn't my home church, it didn't feel the same. And church, I would listen to the sermons. I liked it when we had communion, but it didn't seem like anything other than, all of us together thinking of Christ, of his body and his crucifixion and all, giving us his body, and blood, shedding his blood, but not, the sermons were more how to live your life in the coming week and things like that. They'd read the scripture, but often didn't expound on the scripture. So I really never delved into the Bible until later. So I had the theology class, and I loved that, but I had this surgery and had to drop out of that college. So I never took I had to drop out for a semester because I couldn't sit. See, it was my low back, it was my tailbone. So God seems to use certain things in me because I wasn't happy at that college. Otherwise, I was interested in taking I was signed up for another theology class that semester that I had to drop out. I was just going to go back after Christmas break. So, missing a semester then, in order to graduate the next spring, I transferred to a state university. And then I could go to summer school and all through and graduate and be on my way. So that sort of ended theology because my dad thought his daughters should all be teachers, have a teaching license. And it is a very handy thing to have if you're going to be married and have children. But it wasn't any of our gifts except for my middle sister. And then she had depression and anxiety, so couldn't do it. She couldn't teach. She taught maybe a couple of years and then couldn't. So had children and is very, very close to the Lord through Scripture. She goes to a Bible, more of a literalist church. Bible church is what it would be, a Bible church. And she knows the Bible and it sustains her. So that's good. Anything that sustains and is of God is good in the way I view it. Now she's missing out on some things, yes. But she doesn't realize it. And she's being fulfilled. And also doing lots of charity in ways she can through sewing at home. She's had lymphoma in remission for several years now. But she's very careful about not going out for fear of catching something. Her immune system is low. She has a husband, so they pretty much stay in. He goes to his men's Bible study, and she will go to her women's Bible study. So I have that sister who's very close in, a very strong Christian. And my eldest sister became a Mormon after she married. So we don't have that much in common religiously in that sense of Scripture and things. They go more with the Book of Pearl, the Pearl of Great Price, and the Book of Mormon. So, what else about my church and growing up? I was very impacted by India in 1971, spring of 71. That's when I went. And it was powerful. It was very moving, culturally shocking, upsetting. It got to me, the poverty and the disease and the way people lived then. It's different now. I understand that. But back in 1971, we would go out into the country and we went into Bombay, now called Mumbai. But it was a culture shock for sure. So, the poverty, the street people. Of course, me coming from a nice little Midwest town, I was very sheltered. And it was especially a shock. But the culture was fascinating. I loved the people. And I've always had a soft spot in my heart for India and for people of India. So I'm blessed to know some priests from India too. So that's been a pleasure. I haven't kept up with the one, Father Sebastian. But, and I don't even know where he is now. Last he had called, he was in Australia, but that's been a few years ago. So I have my same phone number. Maybe something's happened to him. He's maybe in heaven now. He was older. And he came to speak when I first became Catholic on they go around to try to get money for the religious order. He's in the religious order of St. Vincent de Paul of Vincentian. And for $25 a month, we could help educate a seminarian. So my son, who was Catholic at the time, we were just fresh Catholics. We decided, with my giving the idea, that if we gave up things like soda pop, or if I took him to Burger King, which we'd only go out to eat if we had a coupon, but if he'd just get water, then we could use all that money, because the drinks are expensive, and put it in a jar. And by the end of the month, we'd have our money. So we supported 2 seminarian students, and they're both now priests and in India. And one of them was in Austria for a while, and I visited him there. So that was the first big trip that I made that wasn't like directly a pilgrimage, but he lined up all kinds of shrines and places for me to see there, and different churches, and that's really all I wanted to see. And in the meantime, driving to all these different places, I would get to see the countryside and the people and the variety of humanity. So that was a marvelous experience. But it was when when I was married, he told me he had been Methodist, and that he'd even been a youth Methodist minister. Well, who would lie about that? But sure enough, ended up not being true. But I didn't know for a long time. But we went, and then he became disgruntled with the minister. And the minister was doing some things not quite properly, or even honestly, I should say, some temporal things. So we decided to try the Presbyterian church. We'd moved and met some friends who went there to this Presbyterian church in this small town in California where we lived at first. And but somehow I think my then husband, after we had I know what happened. I could tell he had lost interest. But we ended up, it's too much story to get into on that, but moving to another location outside of the Claremont Laverne area of Southern California where we'd been living, and went to an area that was just starting up. It still had its little old Western Street. And of course now it's just a big booming metropolis down there. In Riverside County it is, this little town we went to. This little western burg that had just one street with old Western buildings, but lots of land. It was being developed. So we had a house built, but we joined a Lutheran church there. That was about the only church they had other than a Catholic church. And I did mention, well, why don't we try that church? And pointed up at the Catholic church that was already there and was probably I think it was the first church there in that area. Oh, no, we're not going to do that. So we joined the Lutheran church, and he seemed to really like it. But a lot of that was maybe fakery, I don't know. Because it turned out he never went to church again after he left. That would have been only like 2 years later. So, we were there from 80 to 82, and he started leaving in 84, but, and left for good on St. Patrick's Day in 1985. So, but he'd been gone much. And the year before, in 83, he took a job, and he wanted me to stay with my job and the children and work on selling the house, which was hard to sell. It was out in the boondocks then. Now it would be very easy. But, and I'd given up on it. I was so busy working and driving 100 miles each way to get to USC to work on my doctorate. But I still went to church, but he would come home not every weekend anymore, even. Less and less. But I would take the children to church. It was a lovely Lutheran church. I really liked it. I met wonderful people there. and so did he. If he liked to show off in front of people. He was extra gregarious and the life of the party and charming and all that. And also with our children, if we were out somewhere with other people around, he'd be super dad. And I didn't catch on until later that it was just an act for his ego if people were watching. So, but once he left, he never went. He's never been to a church again. He never did. Even in this 5.5 years or so it would have been 6 years that I was still out there before God said, take the children and move back to the Midwest, your hometown. So it took me a year to obey God because I had a hard time believing and discerning and believing that. But it was the truth. That's what God wanted. And he wasn't letting up, and it was for good reasons. So I loved that Lutheran church, the people like me. I was able to create things, and I developed this wonderful Christmas pageant for the children. We went down to San Diego, and I found an upholstery place down there with low-cost bolt ends. It was a place with upholstery bolt ends and other fabrics, curtain and upholstery, and got fabrics for the outfits and organized mothers and elderly people, to sew the costumes. And oh, it was magnificent. And all the angels, my daughters were angels, and so it was delightful. And I think I got that because growing up, my mother was instrumental in putting on a big production of the Messiah in our small town. She would get some opera singers to come from New York to sing the opera parts, and then the local choir would sing along with and be the accompaniment, and a local orchestra. So I think I got my organizing and leading and that from my mother, coming up with ideas, engaging as many people as I can to be a part of the success and the joy of it. And so that was fun. And I think my husband at the time, he liked it because he could do things too and be important. I didn't realize at the time though. And I guess I didn't notice that. Well, I did at home. He wasn't like that, but I didn't figure it out until after he left. So, and then even didn't have a diagnosis until much later when Dr. H and another psychologist were involved in some situations. And then had to meet with him one time only, and that did it for them. They could easily diagnose narcissism and sociopathy with twinges of psychopath. So the way he could become volatile, my ex-husband. So after he was gone, we went back to the Midwest, and I went back to the Methodist church there because it had been such a wonderful experience growing up. But I realized I had grown. I had changed. In the meantime, I started reading and reading and reading. Since the husband left onward, I really delved into reading spiritual life. And also, God started calling me to Catholicism. So that's pretty much my church experience. And I'm grateful for all of it. And it's okay how it is unfolds. But it's been a marvelous experience. So I think that's probably about it. With there's details, but it doesn't matter. It's everything's working out well. So I was still Lutheran in Southern California, and I would be probably still, I don't know, very, very involved in church. I joined another Lutheran church when I got the children moved after their dad left. And from there on, we've been living the life of Christians. So there was a minister in the Lutheran church in the small town where we moved to, who we eventually moved again. So that took pretty much care of our church affiliation, and we went with where God led. I did, and then the daughters were in college, and then the son was in college. But in the meantime, I had become Catholic when I was, 44 years old. So it's all worked out from there. Now, in the Catholic Church, though, with my spiritual life developing increasingly, I've had to learn to adapt and let God lead me. Let God lead me. So that's pretty much my church background, and I'm grateful for the experiences in every church I've been in. And then to understand and move on, and here I am as a Catholic, which I will never be anything else. God worked on me for 10 years to get me to be a Catholic. And though I had to understand that we people, just like in the last Lutheran church I was in, the one in the small town I moved back to, but away from the other small town, I didn't want to go back to the same because my ex would be pestering them, and I just decided I needed a totally fresh start. So I went to the town where my family doctor lived, which was maybe 20 minutes 25 minutes from this other town where we had last lived before we lived in Pacific Palisades. He had a job at Beverly Hills, so we rented for a year, and that was a nice experience too. And I taught a semester at Beverly Hills High, and that's where at lunchtime, I usually didn't go to the lunchroom, but I did one time. It was after my husband had left for the final time and stayed gone. And this man kept emphasizing to me directly, he was an art teacher, head of the art department. We were in the lunchroom, and they had waved at me to come sit at their table, bunch of teachers, which was very thoughtful of them. And he told me about this book that he thought I should read, just out of the blue, as if he knew me. But he says, you need to read this book. It's very important for you. And, I thought, wow, does he, all through, after I found out I was different and was a mystic and had these experiences, I would always be trying to sort of wonder if another person out there does that I could know. And I finally, through these videos, found someone, LS, who is far evolved from where I am in my spiritual life. Far evolved. Much farther. But she's, of course, very, very humble and a marvelous person to share. So at some point she might see this video and help me out with some things, but help explain things or whatever if need be. But so otherwise I had my very best friend married my cousin, my very best friend from the Midwest. But then when I ended up having to move, so we've kept in touch, but it's not been easy We haven't seen each other in a long, long time, but it's okay. We'll make do, and with everyone, my cousin and all these people. Um, my cousin doesn't go to church now, and my good friend from years ago, since I was 10, we met in band. She has some kind of a rheumatic joint pain problem. And my cousin has had a serious amputation years ago, but still, it's very difficult for her now and has been. So she doesn't go. Um, so, but I'm in church. I'm there. I'm Catholic. I love church. I love God, and I have um, spiritual communion, in my thoughts and in my heart. And I recognized that because the sitting's just too much to go and sit like that. You maybe can't tell, but I'm reclining right now. My lower part is flat and my legs are raised and they're up on pillows on the end. But that's to help the neuropathy now coming down from my knee and my lumbar. The pain is causing neuropathy, and eventually I can become paralyzed if I live that long. So I'm very, very religious, and I'm a strong Christian, but I'm just not sitting in the pews. I'm there in spirit. I follow along with the scriptures and I could look online and watch the Mass, but I don't want to do that. I prefer focusing in my mind. I could listen to the sermon, but I like to focus and then pray. So, and I was having ecstasies, and that upset the priest and other people around. And I don't think God wants me to be going to Mass and having people upset. So, it just didn't make sense to me. And what did make sense, because God had been making it clear to me I was to be a traditional, historic type hermit, and to enjoy his vast, all the opportunities that God gives me and told me I would have the night before I became Catholic. So I have a wonderful conversion story. I've shared that already online, but I have learned, though, in any church that we need to be there in spirit and or temporally and be supportive, because the church is all of us plus God, Christ, the divine, the Holy Trinity, also, Jesus Christ, God the Father, Jesus the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So it just takes time to come to a point where we are where God wants us, and to really know it, and then not to make such a big deal out of it, but to be open and loving of all. That's a lot about what all this is about, is to love God and communicate with Him, listen, be with Him, interact with God in our busyness and in our quiet. Always make sure God is first, and then love will be first, because God is love. So that's my history. I fell in love with Catholicism, and although it's mellowed, I'm still very much in love with the Church and with the Catholic Church, all that you can read and understand and be educated on, far more than other churches. And God, yes, can tell everyone what they may not be getting, but there are gaps, there are lapses in some of these other denominations as far as the depth and the treasure chest of the faith. So that's I I don't regret being Catholic. It's painful in a way because I don't want to be away so long from um, I don't know from engaging, and but it's the love of God is very important, and I do miss parishes, but it wasn't working for me. Time after time, God would have something that then priest would be upset, or something would happen, or parishioners, like when I started having the ecstasies. And so it was, and before that, I don't know what bugged them about me, but maybe my focus was so strong during Mass. Um, I wasn't there to chit chat. I was there to absorb every nuance. I love the Mass. So that's pretty much it. I know that there are flaws in every church, but it's because we're the sinners who go to them. And I don't think we should ever quit going or belonging anyway. I'm registered at a parish here. I've not been, but I want to go. I've heard that the architecture inside is glorious, the wood carvings and things. Um, Maybe I'll see if I can take some pictures. We have a viewer who's a fine artist, and she does the most exquisite combination of carved screens and artwork on them. I think she works in oils. I'm not sure, but beautiful. What an artist. A fine artist. Fine. So, that's, I'll stop. This has gone on long, but I think I've said just about everything that, other than, I would pray and pray to ask God's will, and then go off and try to do what I would, got my teaching credential, but teaching was not my gift, not that kind of teaching. Spiritual life is more. Um, and helping people with mystical experiences and things, which another viewer has asked me to talk about. How do you warn people when you get something on a person, when you're shown something by God? And ironically, Dr. H called me this afternoon and said, I just was thinking about you, and he says, I want to thank you again for the day before. I had talked with him on the phone and found out how he'd been having these heart problems. And 4 years ago, I'd had this dream out of the blue that he needed to have heart tests, that something was wrong with his heart. And I called him in real life and told him about the dream. And, oh, no, I'm fine. I don't have any heart trouble. But I'm realizing, I did last night after talking with him, that maybe if he'd gone then to have these tests, he could have preempted, or he has one artery that's always going to remain clogged now. So he's down to 3 that are feeding his brain instead of 4. And the one is partially, but they got it to open up through a procedure. But the other one they can't do because it's so full and the location of it. So he's got that to deal with. Dr. H does. But I mentioned that. I said, because he said, well, it's not the right timing. But yes, he remembered that I'd called him and had that dream. But it's God's will. And in a way, though, it does, because it happened. It really happened. So he's obviously is understanding that to some degree. But we had a lovely talk today and whatever. But that there is another situation of my responsibility when I get a message back in the time period 2, 3, 4 years ago. I should have said, well, are you going to go get this checked out now? Pushed a little, taken the next step with him. And I didn't. So now he's got this heart problem. But I mean, it's serious, but at least they have one of them opened up, did a balloon or some such thing. You went to the hospital already and had those tests done. So have a beautiful evening, and just know that every religious experience that we've had is meant for us in some way or for someone else or both. Usually both, a both and situation. Much love to you all. Remember to love.